So this week we are reading Parshat Acharei Mot. So I'm just going to make one general statement and then we'll begin. One of the things in the background and in my mind when I was preparing, and I'll explain a little bit why, was somebody who I had a relationship with, I think a lot of people looked up to, and that was Senator Joe Lieberman, who had passed away before Pesach. And, some of you know, we wrote a book together. In order to write the book, we actually had a chavrusa together. So we learned a bit, and then we worked on it. And part of what we're going to talk about today is going to be some of the issues that we discussed. It's going to be a little bit broader than we discussed then, and it's going to be a little broader than actually made it in the book. Part of just to understand the background, was the book was about the trip. And I don't just mean geographically, the trip from leaving Egypt to Har Sinai. And his starting point was that he felt that lots and lots of Jews, most Jews, would have some kind of a Pesach Seder, but most Jews never heard of Shavuos. So therefore he wanted to leverage his position as somebody in the public eye who had already written a book about Shabbat in order to speak more about Matan Torah. So therefore, if we'll then just kind of broaden this a little bit to understand, part of what we're going to do is that leaving Egypt had a great deal of impact in terms of Jewish outlook and Jewish ethics, in terms of that we were slaves and we should assure that no one else was ever enslaved. But when it comes to Shavuos, it's more about law. So especially when you're going to have non-observant Jews, so who don't necessarily follow what we would consider to be Jewish law. So therefore the holiday is going to be less compelling. So part of what we're going to do also is to get to issues that deal with law. But as I said, let's begin in a place where the Parsha begins, and that is dealing with ritual, dealing with arguably one of the most important rituals, and that, of course, is the avodah, the service of the Kohen Gadol on Yom Kippur. V'diber Hashem Moshe Acharei Mot shnei bnei Aaron b'krovatam lifnei Hashem vayamutu. So again, for us, just to get, a proper focus and to understand, this conversation comes after the deaths of the sons of Aaron under Avihu. And the obvious question then is, why doesn't this conversation come immediately after the deaths of Aaron? Which means right after they die, there's a couple of conversations between God and Moshe, between God and Aaron, and then we go off on a tangent. And the tangent includes the kosher animals in Shmini, and then it goes on to Tazria Mitzorah. So there are all of these other elements which are added in. So then I guess the question is going to be, so why are all of these things added? Why don't we just go straight to Acharei Mot shnei bnei Aaron, which then will take us to Yom Kippur, which really then thematically goes much better in what we would have anticipated or thought is the topic of the book of Vayikra, which deals with the service of the Kohen, the service of the Kohen Gadol, and that was the trajectory we were on until we get to right after the deaths of Nadav and Avihu, and then suddenly we find ourselves in these other places. Again, kosher animals, which, yes, I can try it, I can contrast it with the animals that need to be brought on the altar, but it's not exclusively that. It's also animals that are going to be in outside of the altar. And then we get to Tazria Mitzorah, which deal with the Mizbeach or deal with the Mishkan in a broader sense, but as I said, in a broader sense, and no longer specifically necessarily the service of the Kohen, although, again, if you stretch things, you can try to work it in. But now we go right back to the service of the Kohen Gadol, and it's really exactly what we were up to. So there's really one word that I want to point to, because this is going to be helpful for us, and that word is tum'ah. And when it gives all the description, it says, V'chiper ala kodesh mitum'ot b'nei Yisrael, u'mipish'eim l'kol chatatam, v'chein yaseh la'o'amod eshachenitam b'toch tumatam. So part of this, I think, is perhaps surprising from the modern mind, from those of us who see Yom Kippur completely in terms of the relationship between man and God, and it's very easy to think of it that way. But over here, there was this other element, V'chiper al hakodesh mitumot bnei Yisrael. That before we got to mipshehim, the chol chatatam, before we got to this other element, the sins and maybe the things on purpose, the things by accident, maybe lahachis and by accident, but there is this need to heal that which is holy from tum'ah. And at the end again, it says, that essentially we're given this Mishkan, Beit HaMikdash, if you will, And part of what we need to do on Yom Kippur is to heal it from misuse. And again, that itself should be interesting. V'hiza aleha pasuk yutet min adam be'etzbo sheva mim v'tiharo v'kidsho mitumot b'nei Yisrael. So again, we want to get rid of the tumah, create tahara. Now, you can all say to me, well, that's interesting because maybe the non-kosher food is, again, about the difference between tumah and tahara. And certainly we could talk about the Parshiot Tazria and Mitzorah are talking about tumah, which we've defined as separation or distance from the Mishkan. But I'll say it again, this is nonetheless interesting because we're not only talking about the individual and the sin which may have stained their souls, but rather we are also talking about the building and the elements within the Mishkan. And then finally, Pasuk Kaf Aleph, V'sarmach Aaron et shnei yadav harosh ha'seir chai v'tvada alav et kol avonot b'nei Yisrael. So here we finally get to the avon. Avon we can describe as the sins. Again, avon, pesha, and chet, or if this were close to Yom Kippur, we would discuss this more. The et kol pish'ehem, the chol chatotam. So, but now we're talking about those of Am Yisrael themselves. Towards the end, in Pasuk Kaftet, Vaytalachem l'chukat olam, and the word chok is going to come up a number of times today. And it says, and that's the part which we much more connect to, that we're going to get atonement, we're going to get kapara, we're going to get purity. But again, the word purity is interesting because it seems then that sin involves some types of tum'ah. Now, to what extent that is a technical term, I mean, I would just throw this out there, and maybe this is obvious to all of us, and maybe not obvious, which is why I have to say it. And that is, as much as tumah had been used till this point to describe the ability of entering into the Mishkan, over here, apparently sin keeps us distant, not from the Mishkan necessarily, but from God. Which means, after all, the whole idea of the Mishkan is an idea of somehow being Lifnei Hashem. And sin causes us this inability of Lifnei Hashem. And by the way, some of the times it's not just the sin that does it, it's almost the self-fulfilling prophecy that does it. But nonetheless, if God tells us to do something or tells us not to do something and we disobey, it creates distance. So it's interesting that Tumah and Ta'ara have been used very much as a metaphor between man and this Mishkan that was built, and God will dwell among us. But it goes beyond the metaphor, and it's used in another sense in terms of man and God directly, without the Mishkan, or without the Beit HaMikdash, and without anything else. And again, Ki b'yom hazeh chaper aleichem l'taher etchem mikol chatotechem l'fnei Hashem titaru, which means the ability, it's l'fnei Hashem which creates purity, and it's the sin which doesn't allow us to be l'fnei Hashem, which again, this Tumah and Tahara idea. Again, the idea chok is going to come in the next pasuk. Shabbat Shabbatoni hilachem v'initim enafshetechem chukat olam. V'chiper hakohen asher yimshach oto v'asher yimalei et yado lekahen tachat aviv v'lavash et bigdei abad bigdei kodesh v'chiper et hamikdash hakodesh v'tol moed v'et hamizbeach yichaper. Again, going back to the same point mentioned before, that the Mishkan itself and its elements need to be purified. V'lakohanim v'kol ha'am kahal yichaper. So again, it's this dual issue. It is the Mishkan, and it is the Kohanim, and it is the people. Vaytazot lachem. Once again, that word luchukat olam lechaper al bnei Yisrael mikol chatatam, to create atonement achad b'shana. So that is our Yom Kippur. We've returned to a Sefer Vayikra theme. Everything is great. The metaphor being used is one of Tumah and Tara. It's one of atonement, but it's also one of purification. And the purification is the soul, and the purification is the building. And we have this wonderful duality over here, which is being introduced. In source number 2, all that we've done is we've gone from Perek Tet Zayin to Perek Yud Zayin. And here it speaks. Again, these two psukim, I want you to pay attention. And I don't care if you really understand the context, because once again, it's talking about the proper way to serve God in the Mishkan, on the Mizbeach, in the Ohel Moed, and so on. And it creates a reich nichoach Hashem. But then it says, meaning that's what you do. That's the that is the Aseh Tov, but now comes the Sur Meirah, and that's in Pasuk Zayin. V'lo yizbechu od et zivchehem l'seirim asher him zonim achareim, which means it can almost be seen as two sides of the same coin. The way that you do it is in the Mishkan, in the Ol Moed, by the Mizbeach. The way you don't do it is to bring offerings l'seirim, whatever that may mean right now. Asher him zonim achareim, and the word zonim is really interesting. Chukat olam lahem l'dorotam. So again, the word chok, it will be something forever, a statute forever. The word zonim is not necessarily the word that if I would have left that word out and given you 10 different words to use, I'm not convinced that that would have been the word that you would have chosen. The reason that I'm saying that is that all things being equal, we would have thought that the word zonim comes in much more naturally when it comes and talks about different types of relationships rather than talking about this particular relationship. Again, I'll remind you, we just read SHIUR HaShirim less than a week ago, and in SHIUR HaShirim there is this wonderful Rashi that talks about the way that you can read the Aseret HaDibrot across, and then it creates this relationship between not doing Avodah Zarah on the one hand and adultery on the other hand, and therefore cheating against God and cheating against one's spouse, especially with the idea of the relationship between God and man, and the idea of Pesach and the damsel in distress and Sinai as a marriage. All of that fits in, but as I'll say it again, it fits in after the fact that the word zonim is used over here, and it's not necessarily one that we would have thought about a priori. Moving just straight ahead, going from Perek Yud Zayin to Perek Yud Chet. So we're still in Parshat Acharei Mot, and now we get to the other relationships, which I just now hinted at. But there's an introduction that needs to be read. V'diber Hashem el lemor, deber b'nei Yisrael v'marta lehem ani Hashem Elokechem. Ki ma'aseh eretz Mitzrayim asher yeshavtem ba lo tasu. Don't do what you saw being done in Egypt. U'k'masei eretz Canaan asher ani mevi etchem shama lo ta'asu u'v'chukoteim lo telechu. And by the way, at this point, the word v'chukoteim should be jumping out you a lot more. If you're not sure, it's read. It's again in pasuk Dalu, the next pasuk. It's going to be a couple of more times over here in pasuk Chavav. You'll see it. Are there others? I'm sure there are, but that's enough now. But it says, don't follow the chukim that they did. Now, if we're going to use the normative definition of chok is something which is done that you don't know exactly why you're doing it. So therefore, God tells us to do things that we don't necessarily know the reason for. And sometimes non-Jews do things that they don't know the reason for. And therefore, we should not be doing the things that have no particular logic to them. There is this famous tshuva of the Maharik that everybody knows, and if somebody doesn't know for whatever reason, then they should know. The famous tshuva of the Maharik is asking about a doctor. Is a doctor permitted to wear, let's just say that doctors back in those days would wear white coats? Can a doctor wear a white coat? I mean, there's no there, or is that b'chukoteim lo telechu? And his answer was, well, it's important in a hospital to know who the doctor is, and therefore you can identify the doctor by wearing the right coat. It's no longer a chok, because there's a reason for it. If it's no longer a chok, then you can do it because we're allowed to do logical things that non-Jews do, right? Chachma b'goyim tamin. You're allowed to do wise things. It's not that if a non-Jew does it, that's it. We can't do it. The logical things we can do, but if it's some kind of, especially a service, especially if it is a mode of serving God, or their gods, that makes no sense, then you're essentially in the realm of Avodah Zarah. But if it's some kind of a practice which makes no sense, you just want to be like them, so then you're on, we'll say it's more difficult territory and may actually be b'chukoteim. But if it's something which makes sense, then almost by definition you would say it's not b'chutechem, and that is that famous Maharik. So let's go back and continue on from that introduction, that we should not be doing the practices that they do. And again, it says what they did in Egypt and what they're going to do and what they do in Canaan. Ushmartem et chukotai. Rather, you need to follow my statutes. Mishpotai asher aseh otam adam v'chai behem ani Hashem. So sets out for us that we follow what God says. It then introduces, and this is going to be easier, Ve'lisha b'nidat tumata. So the word tuma is used over here in relation with to nida, and that we're fine with. Nobody would pause over there whatsoever. There's a logic to it. The only problem is that this is not a section which is dealing, at least I would say, in an obvious way, with Tuma and Tahara, rather it's dealing with a section that deals with relationships, with Ereva, and therefore it continues, it says, Lo tukrav legalot erevata. And it continues, Ve'eshet amitecha lo titon shichvatcha lazara litam'a ba. So that's already really interesting, because over here you're not dealing with one of the types of Tuma and Tahara in the normal sense. This is Tuma and Tahara because of sin. This is really, in a certain sense, the extension of what we saw in the beginning of the Parsha with the Avodah of Yom Kippur, is that sin creates Tum'ah. So here we're being told black and white, sin is creating Tum'ah. And it's at this point that, again, I'm going to stress, we would not necessarily have used this word over here. In fact, we would have done the other way around. We would have used the word that we used earlier in source number 2, when it talked about a type of Avodah Zarah, or not serving in the Mishkan, whatever it is, the Zivchem L'Seirim. Some say it's shadim, and some say other things. But we would have used the word zonim. There we would have used the word tum'ah, because that's something which is inappropriate in terms of service of God. But even though we gave an explanation before, but we would have used the word zonim in this section over here, or some use of the words nut, and tum'ah we would have used there. So it's interesting that things are, in a sense, inversed. This in Pasuk of Aleph, v'lo tichalel et Shem Elokecha ani Hashem. So that's also interesting. But there, it's again, the interaction is fascinating. What was the topic in Pasuk of Aleph? Uv'zaracha lo titein lavir lemolach. So molach is a type of a service. So it's interesting that as it's talking about illegitimate relationships, or relationships that are wrong, or maybe even going under the headline of the practices in Egypt and the practices of the Canaanites, here it says, oh yeah, by the way, don't go and do this thing which is called molach. Don't do that either, because lo techalel Shem Elokecha ani Hashem. It continues with other forbidden relationship. Pasuk of Bet has a relationship, and it calls it a to'eva. We have in Kaf Gimel, we have bestiality. It's called letum abba. So again, the tumah is over here. Pasuk of Talid, al titmu b'chol eila, ki b'chol eila nitmu agayim asher ani mishalayich mipnechem. And it's going back to the introduction of the practices of the Canaanites. And again, but he uses the word tum'ah. Don't do the tum'ah which they did. And I'm sending them away. So now that itself should be somewhat obvious, that causes expulsion. If it wasn't obvious, just read the next pasuk. V'titma haaretz. So now, just like we had before, that the Mishkan could become tameh because of certain behavior there. Now we have the land of Israel can become tameh. By the way, this is the dramatic jump in Vayikra. It's this pasuk really, which is the dramatic jump, because now we realize it's not just the Mishkan is something which is holy. Now we understand that the Mishkan is actually a microcosm for all of Eretz Yisrael, and just like the Mishkan is sensitive to Tum'ah, and there are certain rules and it needs to be fixed at least once a year with Yom Kippur, it's at this point we hear that the land of Israel can become Tameh. V'titma ha'aretz ve'efkod avuna aleha v'taki ha'aretz et yoshveha, and that will cause the land to vomit it out, which is much more severe than anything we heard about the Mishkan. And once again, ushmartem atem et chukotai et mishpotai. Again, the chok comes in there. V'lo tasu mikol ha'to'eva ha'ela, and the word to'eva now is used in the broadest sense about all of these types of behaviors. Ki et kol ha'to'eva ha'el, all of these types of behaviors, asu anshei ha'aretz asher lefnechem. That's what these people did, v'titma ha'aretz, and therefore they caused the land to become tameh. V'lo taki ha'aretz etchem b'tamachem ota kasher ka'at agay asher lefnechem. And now we hear finally, what's at stake over here. What's at stake is that the land is sensitive, and the land is sensitive, the land will vomit out those who create tumah. And that's why these people before you were kicked out. On an individual level, these people are cut off. So I'll say it again. It's really interesting because things are working over here on multiple levels. It's working on the level that this is immoral behavior. This is the type of behavior that one should not do. Good. clear. It works on another level, and that is that not just that this is wrong, is that this creates something which is called tum'ah. Again, and I can say it again, the turn of phrase I used before, it stains the souls of the individuals who do such practices. But then we heard that there's this other element to it, and that is that it also will cause the land itself to reject people who do these things. And now we've seen this parallel between the beginning of the Parsha and the end of the Parsha, the sensitivity of the Mishkan on the one hand, which can absorb Tumah, unfortunately, and therefore it needs to be fixed, and the land, where it absorbs Tumah, it's something which is much more difficult to fix. And ultimately, we were told, that is why the people that were there were exiled from the land. So I'll say it again. I hope that all of this is clear. I just want to try now, as much as we can, to put all of this together on in a bit of a broader sense. Going back a step, Targum Yonatan on that phrase, "V'lo yizvachu shuvat zivchehem la'ililim mishulim l'sheidim," it calls the seirim that was on that pasuk before. Again, we will look at the pasuk again. We're in source number 2 in Pasuk Zayin. V'lo yizbechu od et zivcheihem l'seirim. He calls that sheidim. Asher him zonim achareim. So if it translates Hashem him shehim to'im achareim, which is interesting because it's taking away some of the sting. I mean, the word znut. I think if you call someone a zonah, it'll be a little bit stronger than just calling them a to'ah. Somebody made a mistake. To'ah. Znut, I think, is a bit of a stronger terminology. So it's interesting that over here there's a little bit of downplaying it. The Ibn Ezra, Hashem zonim kikol mi shemvakesh otam umamin bahem hu zona mitachet elokav. By the way, this is much closer to what I had said before. Sheyachshov ki yesh mi sheyitav o yirah chutz me Hashem enechbad v'hanora. So therefore, worshiping the shedim or worshiping the seirim is akin to avodah zarah, and therefore it's zona mitachet elokav. And that's really what I was indicating before in terms of reading Aseret Dibrot across, and therefore it's cheating on God by serving these other things. And but again, this interaction between the Znut and Avodah Zarah is quite interesting. We could skip number 6. It's just going to tell us another element of all of this, including what the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra had to say about the beginning, about this pasuk, which is really interesting. And the Rav has a nice piece in Al HaTshuva about it, but it's not really for today. What I do want to do today is I want to note that the terms that we've noted, or the terms that we've seen, turn up in this other place, and I think that we tend to kind of, I'm not going to say ignore it, but we downplay it, and we just kind of read it in a natural way. Before I get there, I'm going to say something else. The place that I want to get to is the story of Dinah. And the story of Dinah will contain some of the terms that we've seen today. It's also going to contain something else which I think we don't necessarily connect all the dots or pay attention to. And I think, and that itself is really interesting. I think that whenever people tend to discuss the moral issues involved in that chapter, I think that the main thing, the main moral issue, we'll put them in order. I think the main moral thing which bothers people is the behavior of Shimon and Levi. The reason why you would be troubled with Shimon and Levi is because they wiped out a whole town. The reason why you'd be justified in questioning the behavior of Shimon and Levi, because that's what Yaakov does. So if your mode of thinking is in line with the mode of thinking of Yaakov Avinu, then apparently you're doing pretty good. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, you could question the behavior of Dinah, which is terrible, because then it's essentially, let's blame the victim. And there are some midrashim that do that, which do not interest me at all today. And then there's someone else who we can question, and that is Shechem and the city of Shechem and Hamor, and we can question all of them. And it's interesting because they generally, I mean, other than the Rambam has what to say about them, but other than the Rambam, we tend to stay away from that because, well, I'm not going to finish the sentence of because. But just to explain myself a little bit, I'm going down the path that I'm going for multiple reasons. One is, just to be really clear, because it'll be in the back of some of your minds, that after October 7th, then I think it's important to have this conversation. That's one thing. Second reason is because I think that as we continue, we're going to see to what extent this really is important. So essentially, what are we doing now? All the time, whenever we learn Vayikra, I always say, people think Vayikra is difficult. I always say, no, Vayikra is easy. But why is Vayikra always easy? Because I always take other play. I go back to Bereshit. I go to Bamidbar. I keep on moving laterally. But today what we're going to do is we're going to read Vayikra, in a sense, back into the narrative in Bereshit, and we're going to then see what emerges from it. And I think that something that maybe we usually miss is suddenly going to appear, and when it does, it'll be extremely clear. So let's now that you know where I'm going, let's go there. And if in my introduction I spoke about Senator Lieberman, first of all, I want to take away any responsibility on his part for anything that I'm going to say. But one of the things that we did talk about is that this idea of law did not make this dramatic and sudden appearance in, let's say, in the 20th chapter of Shemot. Now, beforehand, we had no idea, the whole thing's a bait and switch. We had no idea that there wasn't going to be any law there. Or for that matter, anytime some verse appears with halachot in it, we say, hold it, where did that come from? No. One of the things that we try to do is to go back and to look at, and again, this was more part of my contribution to the book, was to go back and to look where law makes appearances at earlier sections. So let's take a look, because, as I said, that there's something over here that we're going to be able to connect a whole bunch of things to. Hopefully this will all make sense now. First of all, the more obvious things. One is Vatetzei Dina bat Leah she'yodel Yaakov v'benot Aretz vayaret Shechem ben Chamor hachivi nesi Aretz v'yikach oto yishkav oto vayaneha. Now, what do I want you to do with that pasuk? I want you to do only one thing with it, and that is I want you to scroll back to when we get to source number 3, and we're told that you shouldn't do Kima'asei Eretz Canaan asher ani mevi etchem shama lo tasu. Don't follow their practices. So you say, okay, what was the practices? Well, here is a practice of Canaanites, which means chivi are very nice card-carrying members of the Canaanite community. Okay, if you want, we'll actually look at some of the verses and see exactly where they come from. These people are Canaanites. So therefore, this is the practice of Canaanites. So what are we told over here in Vayikra? Don't do what they did. So then I should be going saying, hold it. Where did we find them doing anything which is not appropriate? So you have it right here. So what I'm doing is, I'm focusing right on the action of Shechem. I'm focusing on Shechem Nesi Haaretz. This is a reputable person doing something which, when he discusses it with his people, he's going to say, this is what it is. And over here, let's again look at some of the responses, and then again we're going to double down on who exactly we're talking about. But who is he? Shechem ben Chamor hachivi. So keep in mind the chivi. That's who we're talking about. Nesi Haaretz. So we're told, let's skip a little bit over here. V'Yakov pasakei shama ki timei et dina bito. So the word timei is the one that I wanted you to pay much more attention to, because that's what Yaakov hears, is that now again, we would have read this independently without the Vayikra flavor to it, but what I'm telling you now is I don't want to read it without the Vayikra flavor. I want to read it through the actions of the Canaanites. Again, there's a stronger point that we're still going to come back to, because it says Kitime et Dina Bito, and Tum'ah you saw came again and again in that chapter. The brothers come back and they were very upset. Ki nevala asa b'Yisrael. Okay, l'shkavet ba Yaakov v'chein lo yaseh. The word nivala, in terms of its connection with arayot, is also interesting, but we're just going to leave that for the moment. And then what we have is, starting with Pasuk Kaf Hey, we have over here the Bnei Yaakov, Shimon and Levi, Achei Dina. They each take their sword and they come to the city. V'ergeu kol zachar, and they wipe out Vet Chamor, Vet Shechem, B'no hergu lefichar v'yichu et Dina mi Beit Shechem v'yitzeu. And at the end, we have Yaakov being quite upset and says, we're a very small number. Yom Yaakov Shimon Levi, Acharei Mot lahavisheni bi yeshev haaretz b'knaani u'b'frizi. Again, we're going to put that together also. And what I'm concerned about is that all these people are going to get together, and then I and my people will be wiped out. So the response is also very interesting. Vayomru, hachazona yaset achotenu. And again, that word zonah. Now, you could tell me, and I'm fine with it, that this is what perhaps we would call, these are, shall we call them, you're looking for something, so you're going to find it. To find the word tumah in this context, to find the word zonah in this context, is not all that remarkable. But of course, what did I do? I try to read it back within the narrative or the laws, not necessarily the narrative, what we saw in Vayikra, and say, well, it's much more interesting to read it like that. Let's just pause here for a moment and look at source number 8, Kahn, because we want to find out about our Canaanites. So we're in the family of Cham, right? Shem Cham Yafet, Cham, Canaan, Yilad Tzidon Bechor Ve'et Chet. So whenever we have the Bnei Chet, remember that's part of the Canaanite family. Ve'et Yivusi, Ve'et Emori, keep in mind the Emori, don't lose sight of them. Ve'et Girgashi, some of these I hope are they flow off your lips as well. We say this, at least some of them. Ve'et Achivi, Ve'et Ariki, Ve'et Asini. Ve'et Arvadi, Ve'et Tzimari, Ve'et Chamati, and so on. These are the Canaanites. So who are the ones I want you to pay attention to? Well, the Emori I want you to pay attention to, the Chivi I want you to pay attention to, and essentially what we have then is we're wondering about, don't follow the behavior of the Canaanites. Well, the Chivi are one of the Canaanites. That's exactly my point. So therefore, let me put it a little bit differently. I can't claim to you, at least not yet, that Shimon and Levi necessarily know the thinking or know the verses which will come up in Vayikra. Right? So far I can't say it. Because think of what I can now claim. That, let's just say that they have this sensibility. You like the word sensibility? It's a much better word. I don't have to say they actually know the verses. I don't have to know that they learned Vayikra. I'm just saying that they have the sensibility. The sensibility is that Canaanites, when they do these things, what does God say? The land will vomit them out, and they will cause tumat ta'aretz. That God says the land of Israel is a holy land and cannot tolerate this type of behavior. Do you realize now how you can read the actions of Shimon and Levi in a very different way? We read it as a private family affair. Their sister was accosted. They go and they take revenge, and we have them full of anger. Do you realize that there could be a much larger theological issue which is taking place here? And that is, as far as they're concerned, these people, the Chivi, have just now forfeited their right to live in the land of Israel. Yaakov is not willing to do it, and Yaakov really mainly on pragmatic, not on theological terms. Yaakov on pragmatic terms is saying there's a whole bunch of Canaanites over here, and the rest of the Canaanites may not be so happy with us, and they may go about and attack us, but Shimon and Levi may be saying that these people are no longer deserving to live here. Which means they're no longer deserving to live here. We are going to follow God's will and get rid of people who behave like this because they are supposed to be vomited out, and let us help God with his digestive tract, or the land of Israel with its digestive tract, as it were, and let us make sure that these people are no longer over here. So my point is, it wasn't just the random tumah and zonah or kizonah which is coming up, and again the sexual outrage which is there. That was the introduction of a much larger issue of deserving to live in the land of Israel, and it's possible now to read the actions of Shimon and Levi in a much different way, if you want. I'll call it a Zionist or a proto-Zionist way, but it's much more. It's not just that, okay, now it's time for us to take the land. But enough of saying all this. Let me read something else, and then I think that things will become a little bit clearer than what I've said so far. Source number 9 is what we need to pay attention to, because I said a moment ago that maybe their sensibility was in line with what it's written in Vayikra, but let's consider what it says in source number 9. Where is this? It's Perek Tet Zayin. By the way, what's really interesting is right before this is when Avram Avinu is forced to go to war. And he's forced to go to war because, again, the behavior of the natives are inappropriate, and they go and they kidnap Lot, and they go to war, and so on and so forth. And Avram goes to war, and afterwards is when we have the Brit Bein HaBetarim. And one of the things that he's told, V'dor Revi Yeshuvohena, Ki lo shalem avona emori adhena. Now that's just a fascinating turn of phrase. First of all, what do you learn from this phrase? Ki lo shalem avona emori adhena. Because their sin is not complete until this point. First of all, what does that verse tell you? It tells you that there, as much as I perhaps would have wanted to say, that all of Bereshit is just about narrative and being, no, there is sin and there's reward and there's punishment. And, you think back about that Rashi in the very beginning of Bereshit, that God created the land of Israel, God created the world, God's in charge, God decides who deserves to live there, who doesn't deserve to live there. And over here, God is essentially drawing up a contract with Avram and saying, you will become the new tenants, you will become the owners, this will be your land, but I'm not willing to evict the previous tenants yet. They need to do a couple of more things which are wrong, and then they'll be evicted. By the way, what is the implication of that sentence? The implication is to Avraham, and if his hearing is refined, and if his moral compass is refined, and we have every reason to believe that both of those elements are true, if his hearing is refined, then what Avraham hears is that I'm giving the land of Israel, but there are conditions. And the conditions is you need to follow the rules. And if you don't follow the rules, by the way, we may not know what all the rules are, but if you don't follow the rules, then you'll be kicked out. Now, what's interesting over here is why of all of the Canaanites are the Emori identified? Why are they singled out? But we are told that, the point is going to come that they're going to be kicked out. And that's for some of the Rishonim is going to create not just Rishonim, some of the commentaries, is going to create all kinds of problems because in terms of God's knowledge and foreshadowing and foreknowledge and so on and so forth. And did they have to sin? Could they have done tshuva? And if you're interested, we can look at some of the commentaries that dealt with this. But God says, no, they're not ready to be evicted yet, but they will be evicted. The Ibn Ezra in source 10, Avona Emori, Mufurash Pasuk Gadol, Avonim and so. And he goes, that kind of concept, it already was before. The idea that Avon can cause exile. I'm over-reading this, right? What did he tell you to look? Let's look at source 11 for a second. Vayomer Kain al hevel achiv, v'hi b'tom b'sadeh, v'yikam Kain al hevel achiv, v'yargehu. So again, misbehavior, murder. Now, will the land tolerate this? Vayomer Hashem al Kain el hevel achicha, where's your brother? V'yom alei adati yishmer achi enochi. Vayomer me'asita, kol dmeicha chetzurkim alai mina adama. Again, notice that land. V'ata arur ata mina adama. So again, we always read this just as an individual event. You continue reading it. Ki tavodata damalot asif ted kochala na v'nad tiyeh ba'aretz. V'yomer kainel Hashem gadol avodi minso. And that's what the Ibn Ezra, by the way, and the Ramban and others tell us to look at. Gadol avodi minso. It means that sin is one which is going to cause ramifications, implications. There's going to be punishment. And what's more interesting here is when we read this through the Vayikra perspective, that again, even though this is talking about murder, this is something which the land will not tolerate, and therefore you will be exiled from the land. And then the theme over here is actually very similar to the Jews later on. One of the reasons we're told also for the first destruction is because Gilei Arayot Shfichat Damim Avodah Zarah, and therefore the Shfichat Damim part causing exile, which is staring at us over here. This becomes one of the rules of engagement over here. So it's interesting that Ibn Ezra took there, and just going back to the Ibn Ezra in source 10, he continues and he says, V'yiskir Moriba Avor Takfo. And why were the Emori singled out? Because they're the strongest. And then Yoshua as well. We'll try to see some of this in a second. If you look at source number 12. Now this is Parshat Chukat. What do you have over here? Vayishlach Yisrael malachim el Sichon melech Amori. And they ask, again, melech Amori. Remember, Avona Amori, behave the Amori. Can we pass through? Ebra ba'artzacha. Again, can we go through, pass through? We're not going to disturb anything, and so on and so forth. V'lo natan sichot Yisrael avor bigvulo. V'yasaf sichon et kol ha'mo v'yitzei l'krat Yisrael midbar. V'yavo yatzav yilchem Yisrael. And they came to war. V'yakei Yisrael lefi charev. V'yirash et artzo. Now, I want to pause here, because here is the beginning of the conquest, but we have to be very careful. Here, the Jews defeat one of the Canaanite nations. The only problem is that this Canaanite nation, the Emori, right now, are not in the Emori territory. Vayirash et hatzor me'arnana yaboko b'nei Ammon, ki az gvul b'nei Ammon, v'yikach yisrael harim ha'ela v'yishiv Yisrael b'kol erei ha'emori b'cheshbon. And then, Ki Cheshbon Ir Sichon Melech Amarihi, V'hu Necham B'merech Moav Harishon V'ikach HaKol Artzom Yado Ad Arnon. This was originally Moabite land. By the way, Moab is a whole different story. Moab is not from Cham. Moab would, if anything, be more connected with Shem, be connected with Lot. So over here, and that was not necessarily what we ever should have taken, but the only reason we were allowed to take it is because the Emori took it before. See, this is not really the proper place the Emori live, and let me explain all this. The rest of this section explains this. Vayishev Yisrael be'eretz Emori. So again, you would think this is the beginning of the conquest. This is the beginning of the story. And I'm going to stress this again, that all that's correct, except this is the wrong side of the Yarden, which again, we can discuss not now. Look at Yehoshua in source 13. Because again, this is what Ibn Ezra is really pointing us towards. On the other side of the Jordan, but on the side which is near the Mediterranean. So as opposed to what you would call the East Bank, this is what you call the West Bank of the Jordan. Et asher hovish Hashem et mei Yarden mipnei bnei Yisrael Avram v'yimas levavam v'lo yabam od ruach mipnei bnei Yisrael. So now the Emori on the other side, they ended up getting scared. So again, we have this Avona Emori, and God is saying, until that Emori, right? Why are they singled out? Well, we were just now told because they're really tough. They're going to be, and we were also told that Moshe starts the fight, and we're told that Yeshua continues it, and now we realize it's all more complicated, two sides of the Jordan, and let's continue. The Radak says, Ki lo shalem avon amari adheina, onesh avon amari lo higi adayin zmano shekablu onsham, ki el yitbarach yarich hapol l'rishayim, l'kol yesh zman katzuf, yesh manisho miyad, yesh marich lo zman rav, essentially saying God runs the world and God knows how He's doing it, and God has His own cheshbon, and don't get involved in it. No, the time has not come yet, although He doesn't necessarily tell us what the problem is. He does also double down on this idea of them being very strong, and he quotes at the very end from Amos, which we'll see in a second, Ki gova arazim gavo. The Ramban also quotes the Zizkera, Hitkif shebem asher ki gavo arazim gavo, that's in Amos. Vanochi yishmadati et Emori mipneihem asher ki gova arazim gavo. They were strong or as tall as cedars, and they were again very powerful, very strong, very tall, very frightening. Emek Davar, the Netziv as well, goes back on this point. Afal gav d'sharei mishpachot kanei yushlam avonon tchila. Even though everyone else already had done all their sins. So this is interesting because it's saying that the Emorite, they still have a little more sin to do. So saying God is saying the time has not come yet, and they are the main inhabitants of the land. So again, that is interesting. Now, if you look at 18, there is a long Orach Chaim, and we're not going to read the whole thing. Those of you who want your homework will have your homework. He goes into something which is really interesting, and he, in a sense, is giving a commentary. Right, he's writing this in Perek Tedvav. Right, this is right in the Brit Abitinurim Avon Emori. There was another thing there. It talked about the fourth generation, and it talks about 400 years. So what he says over here is that based upon the Emori, let me put it like this. Based on the relation with Avram, it only should have been 4 generations. Afterwards, other sins add on to the equation, including Mechirat Yosef, which is going to add on to the time. Not necessarily that the Avona Maria has not come yet. That came by the 4th generation. But our being deserving to enter the land. Because there's 2 sides to this. One is when they've sinned enough to be kicked out, and the other is when the new inhabitants are behaving well enough to enter. And part of what he's going to claim over here is the Meraglim, if you see over here in the middle, he brings in, is that other things are going to happen, which means essentially we have something which is much more dynamic. If you look carefully, or even not so carefully, in source 19, you'll see that essentially what he's doing is he's giving an interpretation based on Parshat Akev, Sefer Devarim, source 19, Perek Tet, where it says, Shema Yisrael, Atam over et Yarden levo l'resh ha'goyim gedolim atzmim Mecca, Arim gedolot v'tzorot v'shemayim, Am gadol v'ram b'nei anakim. Now remember those big, strong people over there, b'nei anak, v'yadat yom keshem lekecha hu over l'chana ish ochla, right? God is going to fight and get rid of all of these people. Al tamar b'lavavcha, b'adof Hashem lekecha otam yifnech lemar b'tzidkati hevi ani Hashem l'resh ha'aretz hazot. It's because I'm so good of Rishat HaGoyim Eila Hashem Risham P'necha. I'm so good and they're so bad. God says, no. Lo b'tzidkatcha uviyosha levavcha asher ataba l'reshet artzam ki b'rishat HaGoyim Eila Hashem Lekecha Risham P'necha. No, it's not that you're so good because you messed up. And by the way, it says it now. It actually spells it out over here, and it says, it talks about He talks about the Cheta Egel, and he says, no, right, Egel Mesecha, it's right here. He goes, don't go and say that we're anti-land because we're so good and they're so bad. No, they're so bad and they're getting kicked out and we're not great. And as I said, the Orach Chaim is going to use some of this to explain the timeline and maybe the 400 years in the fourth generation. All that is great. But this Chizkuni is going to tell us something which is really interesting, and I think this will help us a lot, and then we're going to try to wrap things up after this. He writes, Kilo shalem avona mari, vim tomer ema ein ani machnisam la'aretz miyad. Why don't I just bring the Jews in immediately? Tshuva davar, kilo shalem avona mari, yoshev aretz adhena ador v'i. Again, dor v'i, as opposed to 400 years. Avon Emori katav Emori yoter mishar omot lefti shahaya Avram Yoshev ba'alonei mamrei ha'emori. That Avram lived in the Amori section. By the way, is that clear? Is that pshat? Did it say that in the Chumash? If you're not sure, then just say yes and look at the next source, the next pasuk. Source 21. And this is back Perek Yudalid, Vayavo Palit Vayigid LaAvram HaIvri, V'hu shochein be'elonei mamrei ha'emori. That's where Avraham lived. He lived in the land of Emori, which is actually then telling us, the Chizkuni is saying, why does the Avona Emori, why does it take more time for the Emori to be kicked out? Because the Emori have Schut Avot. What's their Schut Avot? They were hospitable to Avram Avinu. By the way, just think about the poetics over here. Avram is hospitable to everybody else. They were hospitable to Avraham, and therefore God says, I will take my time until they kicked out, and therefore they need to be deserved to be kicked out because that Avraham lived in that midst. Again, the irony is that when Avram goes into the land of Israel, and every place he walks, he creates a kinyan, and he creates an acquisition, and creates a spiritual connection to it. But it's interesting that nonetheless, somebody there was hospitable to Avraham, and the Chizkuni really is telling us that that is part of the equation over here, that Avram lives in that particular place. We'll just add on, I think the Meshech Chochmah in 23 really goes down the same direction. I think he says the same thing. But in 22 and 23, both of these sources, 22 is Rav Yochanan Luria, and 23 is the Meshech Chochmah, they're both going to say the same thing. And that is, hold it a second, what about Tshuva? What if the Emori would have come and done Tshuva? Would they have been able to stay in the land? So he says, no. So then why say they're getting kicked out because of their behavior? So let's just set things up correctly. The land of Israel belongs, according to, again, both of these interpretations, it belongs to the children of Shem, and that's where Avram comes from. The children of Ham have no right to the land, which means if they would have done tshuva, let's just maybe look at the end of 22, because ume'azim yasu tshuva right here, v'yachseru hagezel leba'aleim lezer Avram shegam hu mizaros shoshem v'tkayem hamtana v'gam liyasa kadosh baruch hu kala v'haven. What he's saying is that no, they could have done tshuva, and then they would not have been wiped out. They would have been removed, but they needed to return the land to the rightful owner, and the rightful owner is OUIsrael. As the Meshech Chochmah says the same thing a couple hundred years afterwards. If they begin to behave. But what does that mean? V'yaseh yashar b'nei Hashem. Halo yishma kol divrei navi shedeber elav b'shem Hashem. I mean, if they would have done the right thing, lemar, what would have been the right thing? Tana ha'aretz hazot levnei Avram. Give the land to the rightful owner. V'im lo yishma lachricho b'chazaka u'legaresh oto b'cherev nokemet bal ye'ot. Ad ki yishtaresh ba'avono v'yigbar chata'o. V'az yeh ra'oi legaresh b'cherev. V'frat ki zeh nuvuah sha'aretz hi shel b'nei Shem kvar noda l'kol b'nei Noach minoach Avihim. Asher haya navi la'Hashem lemor baruch Hashem Elokei Shem. So he says, and look at Rashi there. He's saying, no, the land of Israel, the land of Canaan was already given to the children of Shem, and therefore they were usurpers and they had no right to be there. The last thing I'll mention, I think, is the Seichel Tov in source 24. The Midrash says, Ki lo shilem avon amori, v'hu adin l'shivat amim, ki adayin lo malasa atam, ki ad akshav hayu gdurim be'erva. Ki b'rishatan hichtiu v'ichnithu et haaretz v'tamua ad shehaki'atan. V'lo chatam HaKadosh Baruch aleim gzar din li'abed ad shemalei satan. Now this is really interesting because he did the obvious thing that I've been doing the whole time, but he was the only one who I saw do it clearly, and that's he's saying is that this idea of the Vona Marie is connected to what we saw in Vayikra. The idea of the Vona Marie is the reason that people get vomited on the land. The idea of the Vona Marie, and what he's claiming is that why are they not kicked out yet? Because at the point of this particular prophecy in Perek Ted Vav, right by the Brit Bein HaBetarim, they had not begun to act in their immoral ways that later on they will. So which now, let's try to put everything together. At which point do they begin to act in those immoral ways? When do we find that? Well, we find that in Shechem. In Shechem, they begin to act that way. So therefore, Shimon and Levi's response is, okay, here's the Avon HaEmori, if you will. Here's the Avon of the Chivi, and the Chivi no longer have any right to be here. If you want to then go a little bit further, what we're seeing then is that Sefer Vayikra is explaining to us the background which we've already seen from Bereshit, and that is the Avon HaEmori is the same idea of the behavior of the Canaanites. Which means essentially I'm saying read these things together. Read the Brit Bein HaBetarim together with the Parsha of Dinah, together with Parshat Acharei Mot, and I think a much clearer picture emerges. Before we enter the land, what are we being told? That we need to behave differently. And therefore it's specifically in terms of these rules of the Arayot is when this is introduced, but that's exactly what's being told previously. Now, again, we saw different ways of nuancing this or finessing this. Some are going to tell us that the reason the Emori are still deserving to be there is because they did some good things. And again, hospitable to Avraham, and therefore they allowed a stranger to live in their midst. That is something which is very Avraham-like, and therefore they have the right to be there for a while. Till which time that becomes more complicated. Which means to what extent does our misbehavior during the time in the desert, does the sin of the Egel, which again is interesting in terms of this interaction between Znut and Avodah Zarah and Znut, and causing Tum'ah, to which point, are we deserving to enter into the land? So now we realize that time in the desert is essentially, it's not just, like this, we can't go derech eretz v'shtim ki karovhu, we can't go there yet, which means our sin is what causes us to be moving away from the place of the Shekhinah. The Mishkan in our midst, on the other hand, creates, in a certain sense, a microcosm of having holiness in our midst, which then is hopefully going to prepare us for when we enter into Eretz Yisrael, which, yes, we'll have a Mishkan, and yes, we'll have a Beit HaMikdash eventually, but it's really, what we've come to realize was that there is this micro and macro relationship between the Mishkan, Beit HaMikdash on the one hand, and the land of Israel on the other hand. And therefore, the use of the word Tum'ah throughout Parshat Acharei Mot was the thing which I think was the most interesting part of it, and therefore it's there in this whole section of you're going to do Tum'ah to the Mishkan. A place can become Tameh. Yes, a place can become Tameh, and that's what we learn in terms of Eretz Yisrael. You can make this place Tameh, and therefore what's going to happen? Then you're going to be kicked out. So therefore, you need to recognize that sin causes not just distance from God, but it causes distance from a Mishkan, it causes distance from a Beit HaMikdash, and it ultimately causes distance from Eretz Yisrael, which means living in Eretz Yisrael requires one to have a different type of an outlook. This takes us back, as I said, to maybe a different read over the Shimon and Levi and Dinah and Shechem story, that maybe at this point they're no longer deserving to live here, and of course what comes before before that is that wonderful phrase of the Avona Emori. So now we realize that they may have been guilty at that point of the Avona of the Emori. And at that point, they're no longer deserving to be in the land of Israel. So as I said, I hope that you're able now to read through all of these sections and see the way that these things may actually be interconnected or interrelated. But as I said, essentially what we did is that we took the ideas revealed in Vayikra and said, oh, let's pay attention, because that may have been the meaning of things that we saw long before here in Bereshit. And the reason why it shouldn't be strange at all is that what was happening in Bereshit is that Avram and later on Yitzchak and Yaakov are being promised the land of Israel. And what are we told? That there are rules. There are rules of engagement, and you don't follow these rules of engagement, you end up leaving. But what we've learned on top of all of that is these other words which are being used with it, and that again, most importantly, is this word of tum'ah, which now has been used in a much broader sense than I think that we had noted before or noticed before. And therefore, Yom Kippur again is this wonderful day that we're able to turn tum'ah into tahara, which itself is this unbelievable gift of God that we can even do such a thing, that you are able to turn tum'ah into tahara, especially when you talking about the other type of tum'ah, one which is in our hearts and one which is in our behavior, and one even talking about the building itself in terms of maybe you would have thought that once something is ruined, it's ruined, and there can be no reversal. So it's interesting that even though that it sounds most likely that the Emori were not able to do tshuva, and it wouldn't have helped them because they weren't the rightful owners, that we are the rightful owners, but we still need to be deserving to be in the land. But you're still here. It means you want to say something.
Hey, I'll bring you a pasuk in the future from Yonah. Why did he rebel against the word of God and try to run away? What was his problem? The problem was he was told to speak to Nineveh, which is the capital of Ashur. Ashur is the country that's going to invade Eretz Yisrael and basically kick the 10 tribes out of Eretz Yisrael. He was afraid of that. So he didn't want to go. He was forced. He spoke to them in a minimal way. But how did he know that he failed? Because when he was in the fish, he davened. And then it says, Vayakei et hadag, that the fish threw him up. The word throw him up told him that the Gzar Din had already come down. That Eretz Yisrael will be vomited out of Eretz Yisrael.
Is that in your article? The vomiting is there. Oh. Okay. So my father wrote 2 articles on Yonah on a literary level, so you're going to have to go find it. If you're interested, you'll let me know and I'll send you a copy. Okay. Everybody, B'sarot Tovot.